Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today, we will look at enhancing the CSV reader application created in the last video in your Windows client application using the My Little Grid custom grid add-on. This was our CSV grid application at the end of the last video. What we have is an application that when run will prompt you for a CSV file, and it will display that CSV file in a grid. What we're going to do today is we're going to add a toolbar to the top of our dialog to allow you, while the application is running, to pick a different CSV file, and we're also going to put a label on the form to indicate how many records have been returned when the file has been loaded. So let's have a look at the code. In our PB main function, this is where we prompt the user to select the CSV file. This is using the display open file to prompt the user to pick a CSV file, and the name of that CSV file is passed to the main form, which then displays it in the grid. However, a few things we want to tidy up from the last video. If we run the program and we hit cancel, it still displays the dialog. This is because there is no trap on the name of the file. What we need to do in here is to put an if statement. If the file name return is blank, then we just exit the program. That makes it a little tidier. If the user picks cancel, then the application just terminates. What we want to do first of all is to put the toolbar at the top of the dialog. So if we go into the Tools menu and pick PowerBasic Forms, this is our form. All we need to do is double click on the toolbar control and it will display a basic toolbar. It does put some icons at the top of the dialog which we'll make use of, and it puts some sample code into your application which we'll also amend and make use of. So if we save that and go back to our main application, we'll find, if we have a look at the form itself, we'll find there is a sample toolbar function being added to the program, making use of a new toolbar. If we have a look at the sample toolbar, we'll see in here it is in fact using the image list command to add 3 icons to the image list and then displaying each of those icons on the toolbar at the top of the dialog. So if we ran our application now and picked our file, we would find there is indeed a toolbar at the top of the dialog with 3 buttons on it. Each button just has a message box behind it, but for the purposes of what we're doing today, we only need the one icon. We want the open icon. So to make life simple, we will just comment out where it's adding to the toolbar the new icon and the save. And this will give us just the one icon on the toolbar. Now, if you're wondering where these icons came from, they're being referred to as constants, but if you have a look at the top of the program, you'll find no reference to the constant itself. This is actually held in a resource file. All the loading we've done into PowerBasic up till now has been for .bas files or .inc files. The other option is to load resource files. If we load the RC file, we'll see in here there are a definition for each of the 3 image files, and further down where the icons are defined, these are the icons which are referenced by each of these constants. We'll go into detail to resource files in a later video, but I thought I'd mention it today because it may be something you've not come across before. So having got our icon on the screen, we'll need to put some code behind it. So if we have a look at the event handler, the callback function for the dialog itself, we'll see that in here the forms designer has put some conditional statements in here for us. Now We're not interested in the new button, so we'll just comment that one out. And we're not interested in the save button, so we'll do the same for that one. And we'll take out the message box in the open dialog. This is the one where we want to load the new CSV file. Now, just as we did in the PB main function, we'll need to give the user the option for selecting the file. So for that, we'll need two local variables, which we'll put up at the top of the callback function. One for the file name and one for the flags. And we'll just paste in the code we had in the PB main function to set the flags and to call the display open file command. Calling this command will then allow the user to select a CSV file from somewhere on the computer. And as we did before, if the str file variable has actually been populated, then it means the user has actually selected a file and we can attempt to reload it. So the first thing to do is to test that variable. So we're testing to make sure the variable is actually populated and a new file therefore must have been selected. Now the new file the user has selected may well have a different number of columns and a different number of rows than the file that is currently displayed on the dialog. Therefore, the first thing we want to do is to clear the grid. Now, if we look at the utilities we've got set up for the My Little Grid, we have a macro in here that does exactly what we want. So the first thing we'll do then is we'll call this macro, and our grid is hgrid1, so this will clean the grid out of all the data. Now we want to read the data into the array just as we did in the beginning of PB main. So we're calling another library function to read the CSV file into an array. It takes two parameters, one being the name of the file and the other being an array, which we'll need to dimension at the top of our callback function. So if this is true, we have successfully loaded the file into an array. Now, as we did before, we can then put that array directly into the grid using the MLG putX command. It takes our array and slots it nicely into the grid. And just as we did before, we're going to call three other utility routines. One to widen the columns in the grid to match the data that's inside them, the second one to colour bank all the grid rows, and the third one just to refresh the grid. So if we try that now, we pick our original file and it displays quite nicely. We click open to pick a new file. Now I've created a larger CSV file here to demonstrate this. If we pick that and click on it, now it has displayed different information, but I know that the new file is much larger than the first one. It has more rows and it has more columns. However, although we've changed the title of the column, we have not actually added any additional columns. Now the reason for this is that My Little Grid maintains an array in the background which it uses to define the grid. So we'll need to use a new command here to redimension the array at the back end of My Little Grid. So before we put the data into the grid, we need to use the MLG array redim command. It takes a number of parameters, the first being the grid handle, and then a value of the rows and a value for the columns. Now, as we saw, the number of columns and the number of rows has actually changed. So since we've taken this into an array, we can actually pull out from that array the number of rows and number of columns that are now in the array. So we'll use two new variables, rows and columns, and we'll create these at the top of our callback function. And we're using the ubound command to work out what the greatest number of elements in that array on the first dimension, the number of rows, and ubound again on the second dimension to work out how many columns there are. Now the additional parameters we have here, we've got rows and columns again. Basically this is the minimum number to prep it for, and this is the maximum number. So we're adding 10 extra rows just to give the My Little Grid at the back a little bit of elbow room, just in case it needs to add any extra rows. And the same with the columns. Now, we're not actually going to be dynamically changing the number of columns and number of rows within the grid without loading another file. It's good practice to give it a little more room than it actually needs. So, having redimmed the array, we can then put the data back into the array itself. So if we try running our program now, and we pick our original file, which has 5 columns, and if we click on open to pick our larger CSV file, we'll see that it has now added an extra column and considerably more rows to the data. So this is how we can actually keep the same grid on screen and populate it with different amounts of information, either big or small. If we picked the smaller array again, we'll see that the size of the grid has dynamically gone back to the size of the data. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to display at the top of the screen how many rows have been returned, which is quite an easy one to do. So if we go back to our PowerBasic forms, and we want to add in a label, move this one down just a little bit and over. Now we'll change the name of this to be something a little bit more helpful. Start off with 0, and we'll make it a nice shade of blue. Right, so if we save that, and reload again, so if we then go into our dialog first of all, so after we put the data into the grid in our MLG putX command, we can then amend the value of that label to match the number of records returned. And we're going to use the new value we put in. Now we know that long rows is the number of records we've actually pulled in because we determined it up here. So having put that in there, we'll just copy that, and if we go into our event handler where we're loading subsequent files, now let's put these ones back in again, so we'll just comment them out. In fact, we'll just take them out altogether. Keep it nice and tidy. Now down here where we're loading it in, just after we put the data in, we can paste that in. Now we need to change the dialog pointer to CB handle in this case, but that should, once we've got the data back, it should put the data in to our label to say how many rows we have actually returned. So if we run that now, run it on the smaller file, tells us there are 8 records, which there are indeed. And if we pick a larger file, let's pop these on the toolbar again, which we'll need to take out. And if we go into the large file again, it's 745 records, which is perfect. So just to tidy up, we will go back to the sample toolbar and we'll comment these ones out. Right, so if we run now, we'll quite happily see just the one on the screen. So there we are. We've now enhanced our CSV file display program to allow it to select additional files and display them on the grid quite dynamically. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for watching.